Have you ever wanted to explore strange new worlds with your bitchin' 70 space van? Come and check out TSR Star Frontiers tonight on the Old Dragoon. Tonight we're going to talk about an old favorite of mine, TSR Star Frontiers game. Now the version you're seeing here on the desktop, this is the original printing of Star Frontiers that came with a blue cover. It was later repackaged as Star Frontiers Alpha Dawn, and there really wasn't a whole lot of difference aside from the cover and the trade dress. The meat of the game was by and large identical. So today we're going to take a look at the far more common Alpha Dawn version. This is the version that you can get in PDF and in print on demand from DriveThruRPG today. So let's look at Star Frontiers and see what's going on with it. So, the Star Frontiers box set originally came with several items inside. There was a set of basic game rules, which was a very thin cardstock cover saddle stapled booklet. This had the bare bones of Star Frontiers and this piece of artwork from Larry Elmore, which is involves an explorer van, and I'll talk about why I love those later. So you also got an expanded game rules book, a module called Crash on Volturnus, a large fold-out map, a cardstock map, and a couple of hundred counters. Now these little square counters are very similar to the ones you found in, say, Gangbusters and a couple of other early TSR games, and they allow you to use tactical combat even if you don't have a ton of miniatures. In fact, the scale on the maps would make the use of miniatures a little bit crowded in some cases, and so these tiny little chits are probably your best bet for this sort of thing, unless you're going to build some larger terrain. So let's look at the basic game rules and see what exactly Star Frontiers has going for it, and we'll discuss a couple of things that it could have used some improvement on. So this is the basic game rules. Like a lot of books from that time period, the interior of the cardstock covers was printed in that blue color. Now I've heard rumors that this color was chosen because at that point in time it was difficult to photocopy. But given that this is just basic history and a table of contents, I'm not quite sure that was a concern with this book. So as you can see, this is only a 16-page booklet. It does give the very bare bones of Star Frontiers, but it does include something that we'll get to on page 9 that really should have been in the expanded book because it's easy to overlook. So we have a glossary full of terminology for Star Frontiers. Now, it's not just game terminology. There's also some of the alien races you'll encounter here, some of the types of equipment you'll encounter. It's actually pretty useful. And here's a character sheet from the back cover. You could go photocopy these if you needed to. As you can see, the character sheet's pretty simple. There's not a lot to it. Star Frontiers was also a fairly simple game. Now, one of the things that's missing from the front of the character sheet are skills. You can see there's just a note at the bottom that says record the skills and equipment on the reverse side. I kind of would have liked to have seen the skills on the front of the character sheet as they're very important to your character, but there was a set of character sheets made that you could buy, back in the day when photocopiers weren't everywhere and you could buy pads of character sheets. That would largely replace this one that was included in the game. So, Star Frontiers. We're going to see some Jeff Easley and Jim Holloway art in here in addition to the Elmore covers. And boy, does that art just bleed Star Frontiers to me. There is just something about this mixture of artists from the early 80s that is just atmospheric for me for Star Frontiers. So the introduction has a little bit of fiction that is fully illustrated. You can tell by the looks on some of these faces, this is Jim Holloway. This is the artist that did Paranoia and a lot of early Battletech and a whole lot of Star Frontiers. Holloway had this very distinctive look to his characters. And their facial expressions and especially their eyes were very distinctive to his style. So, right off the bat, we see this is another percentile dice system. There were a lot of those going on in early TSR with the exception of D&D. There was a version of Gamma World that used straight D% and a table not unlike the one we saw in Marvel Superheroes. Marvel, of course, used D%. Gangbusters used D%. Top Secret used D%. And I think part of this is that percentages are something that are very familiar to even people who aren't gamers. As I said in one of my earlier videos, the average person may not be able to quote the bell curve off 2 or 3d6 off the top of their head, but they all have a pretty good idea of how often you're going to be able to make, say, a 66% chance of something. So we get a short bit of information on how to use the dice. Basically how to roll percentage. And then we talk about character creation. Your ability scores in this game are paired. That is, you roll for each pair, and most of the time they're going to be identical until we get to the advanced rules. So strength and stamina, dexterity and reaction speed, initiative and intuition. Initiative is not an ability, initiative is calculated. Intuition and logic, and personality and leadership. We have several options, humans being the standard, right? The similar to Earthmen but developed on another planet humans. Dralocytes are sort of multicellular amoebic life forms. They can change their shape. Now, they are not shapeshifters in the I'm going to disguise myself as someone sense, but they are shapeshifters in the I kind of need a third arm, I think I'll grow one sense. We also have Vrusk, which are large centauroid insect creatures. Basically, they're built like a centaur in that they have a body that is parallel to the ground and then an upper body with what we would recognize as arms. They are multi-limbed, they have compound eyes, and their arms can rotate further than human arms, making them able to, say, throw things with great accuracy and speed. And they're, I believe, naturally ambidextrous. Yazirians are kind of like Wookiees. In fact, they have a battle rage, but they're from a lower gravity world. So while they are the battle ragers, they are also, on average, less strong than the other species. Yazirians also have a skin flap between their arms and their legs that allows them to glide if the atmosphere is thick enough and the gravity is just right. So they're pretty cool in that respect. Something else to remember about Yazirians, they are almost always depicted wearing these goggle sunglass things because their eyes are sensitive to what we would consider normal light for a humanoid species. So to create the characters, you roll D percentage, and you're not rolling a straight percentile, you're looking it up on a table that gives you scores between 30 and 70. You then modify them by the species abilities. If you look down at the bottom of page 4, you can see the table that shows that Dralocytes tend to be a little stronger, Vrusk less strong, Yazirians much less strong. Yazirians tend to have a little bit better intelligence and logic going on. Dexterity is worse for Dralocytes, but better for Vrusk and Yazirians, and everybody has about an even personality and leadership. Now you'll notice that the writers of Star Frontiers, and that's a point we'll get back to in a minute, the writers of Star Frontiers seemed to lean against some of the tropes that they've written into these characters. For instance, the Yazirians have the battle rage, but they also have a higher intelligence and logic. So, and a lower strength. So they're not the species that you would think would develop the battle rage. The Yazirians can generate limbs equal to their dexterity divided by 10. However, they take a hit on dexterity. So the race that needs it most has at least. So they do sort of give some opposing traits to these species to make them a little more interesting. And yes, I'm using the word species. They use the word race. It's just a modern thing. So once you have calculated your initiative, which is your reaction speed divided by 10, and figured out your standard stats, then your character is more or less ready to play, with the exception of equipment. So basic characters are pretty basic. So with the basic rules, we get a lot of combat crunch. That's something that was common to many TSR games. I mean, even Gangbusters had combat crunch. And so we get a turn sequence. You can choose one action: move, move and fire, reload, or basically pass. The turn sequence happens in initiative order, and the different species have different movement speeds. So that's pretty straight up. There are rules for things that appear on the specific map you're given, which is the map of a spaceport, like, for instance, the monorail and parking areas and buildings. Much like the Marvel map of a city or the Gangbusters map of Lakefront City, you basically have a very detailed map of a starport. Now, there is a cardstock map of a Starship Bridge area, but that's specifically included for the Crash on Volturnus module that's also in the box. So the map that you'll theoretically being used most often is the spaceport map. So they include specific details on how the spaceport map works. We get line of sight diagrams. We get turning diagrams for vehicles, and vehicles do factor pretty heavily into Star Frontiers. There's some really cool ones. We find the damages for various different weapons. These are different from the expanded game damages. For instance, the laser pistol and laser rifle do a set amount of 1d10 damage here in this version, but when we get to the advanced version, you'll find that you can adjust them, which is pretty cool. The ubiquitous grenade bounce diagrams that we got in everything, including Advanced Dungeons and Dragons back then. And rules for automatic hits, anything from a 1 to a 5 on your D%. And how damage works. One of the things that I have had levied at Star Frontiers is that it takes forever and a year to fully drop an opponent or to have a PC drop from damage. And in these basic rules, that's exacerbated a little bit. You have hit points equal to your character's endurance, which is generally, if we look back at the table, between 30 and 70, usually clustering between 45 and 50. So you're starting the game with that number of hit points. And I'm sorry, that's stamina, not endurance. I've got too many game systems rattling around in my head. So if you take a D10 damage, that's going to average out to about 5.5, 6 points, meaning that you'll need to hit someone, say, 7 to 8 times to put them down with the laser pistol. And that's not counting any sort of defenses they may be wearing. If they are wearing a screen or a suit that helps absorb laser damage, it could take a lot longer. So thank heavens you can adjust laser damage in the advanced version, and yeah, we'll get into that. So ammunition is generally done with battery packs for all the energy weapons, and things like gyrojet pistols or needler pistols have physical ammunition, much like a slug thrower. In fact, slug throwers are available in the advanced rules. And here's where we get to something that I alluded to earlier. Something I really, really like that was included in the basic rules, but you have to refer back to this little booklet if you want to find it again. And that is the standard equipment pack located on page 8. The standard equipment pack comes with items that would be generally useful to a character. And I have used this many times in my Star Frontiers games as sort of the care package that you receive when you arrive at the frontier. It's intimated that the home worlds of the various species in Star Frontiers are far from the frontier. The frontier is the literal frontier of explored space and the area where these species got together and decided to work together to establish colonies and especially commerce. There's a lot of megacorporation stuff included in the booklet, the advanced booklet, that is. So the standard equipment pack I have always used as something that people spending their last credits to get travel out to the frontier to start their lives over again, they would basically be handed this as part of their package when they set foot on one of the main stations, say at Pringlar or Cassadine, and said, here you go, start your new life, here's your basic gear, go find a job. And so a lot of times, rather than the characters going through extensive shopping trips and finding that they don't have enough money to buy a whole lot of anything, I hand them the standard equipment pack in addition to the credits they start with. So this does explain some of the neat little technical things that you find in Star Frontiers, like the Doze Grenade, which is the only weapon included in the standard equipment pack. Things like Stimdose and Stados, which are medications. Your standard issue ID card. Survival rations, the pocket tool, and things of that nature. So there is a short basic adventure included, the Pangalactic Security Breach, where you're hired by Pangalactic Corporation to take care of some issues that they're having. That is a recurring theme in Star Frontiers, that you'll be hired by the Megacorps to do things for them, which is kind of a handy way to give your characters some direction. But it also plays against what some players might expect, like especially players coming over from Traveler. They may want to establish their own sorts of endeavors and kind of chart their own course without working for the Megacorps. It's doable, but you almost need the second box set in the series to really make it happen. And we'll touch on that too. So we have the basic adventure, which is programmed much like a choose your own. This is a little bit like the Menser introductory adventure, but not quite as well developed. And then we have some creatures. Little bit of information on creating your own adventure. And that's it. I told you it was a short book. Let's take a look at the advanced rules, which is probably where most of the people who are established role players want to jump straight into. Remember that at this point in time, TSR was just getting into mass market, right? This is where the Moldve basic box set came in, and a plethora of other box sets like, Gangbusters. In 84, 2 years after this box set, we got Marvel and Indiana Jones. They're really trying to explain this whole role-playing thing to people who may not be familiar with it. So this little 16-page book is intended to introduce people to role-playing if they have never role-played. Hence, sort of the leaning into maps and counters and things, making it a little bit more like a board game, just long enough to understand what you're doing. So let's look at the expanded rules. Different cover art. This is the cover art that was used on the cover of the actual box, and this one is pretty iconic too. I have a print of this that I'm going to get framed and hang up. Unfortunately, my game room is all bookshelves, and I have very little space for actual art. So we'll figure it out at some point. But this is the expanded rules. This is a little closer to the size of the Moldve basic D&D rulebook, and that is, it is roughly 64 pages. Now here in the back cover, you will see this includes something that was a staple of early TSR books and something I really, really love, and that is Appendix N. At least that's what we called it in D&D terms. This is fiction and nonfiction books that are considered good reading to get ideas for what to do with your Star Frontiers campaign. I spent a lot of time in middle school and high school going through the reading lists in D&D and D and here in Star Frontiers and in some of the other games of the period, and really immersing myself in some of the suggested fiction. I was a huge fan of the novel Starship Troopers as a kid, and I still go back to it from time to time these days. Some of the themes of Starship Troopers may raise an eyebrow these days, but I still feel like it contains the single best explanation of the difference between the duties of an officer and a non commissioned officer in the military. The whole turning over your platoon to the officer like a well tuned violin, that is right about where a good NCO should be. And I love it. So you've got all of these things to take a look at, and I've read quite a few of them. To my dismay, when I took my kids to the public library that I grew up going to, most of these books had been weeded, probably because none of them had been checked out in years. But they're all worth a read, and in this day and age, you can get them on audio, you can get them on Kindle. So, there is an index on the back of the book. That's pretty useful as well. Here we go. Star Frontiers Expanded Rules. So, this is a 64-page booklet. We go into the basic introduction. It covers some of the things that were covered in the basic book. But let's start taking a look at where this diverges. So, character creation is similar, but there are a few extra steps. First, you can modify your ability scores by shifting points from one side of the slash to another. If you want your character to have more stamina than strength, you can bump some points over. If you want your character to be faster than they are dexterous, or smarter than they are logical, you can do that. Humans will get an extra 5 points to add to any one ability score to kind of offset the fact that they don't get the neat special abilities that the other species get. Which, in step 7, we find that Dralocytes have a 5% lie detection ability on top of their elasticity and ability to change their shape. The Vrusk have a 15% comprehension ability. This allows them to understand, say, social cues in a new species or a species with which they're not familiar simply by watching and observing. Yserians, of course, have the battle rage that we talked about. All of these basic ability scores can be directly increased by spending experience points, and a lot of players that choose these species do exactly that. So, you've got to choose handedness. Dralocytes and Vrusk don't have to worry about it. You select your character's physical sex, unless it's a Dralocyte, in which case they don't have any. They reproduce by budding. You roll for starting money, and you move on. Now, the thing that's going to be very different between this and the basic rules are skills. Before we go into skills, let's go ahead and cover the experience points, because this is something that's both cool and a teeny bit vexing. You spend experience points pretty directly. If you want to raise your ability scores, it's a 1-for-1 cost, which is great, and it's simple, but it can result in your players dumping all their XP into an ability score until they max it out at 100. The reason they might want to do that is that, of course, stamina is direct hit points, and dexterity is used in calculating your 2-hit chance with all weapons. Pretty much, because your base chance to hit is half your dexterity, every 2 experience points your players drop into dex is an extra percentage point toward hitting the enemy. That will add up pretty fast as adventures go by. You can raise the racial abilities on a 1-for-1 basis, and then you can buy your skills. This is where you'll have to spend more than 1 point at a time. Now, something that's neat is the way the species are presented. They have sort of not quite Vitruvian artwork of the species. They tell you their average size, their average weight, their average lifespan. They give you some data on how they work. Dralocytes are pretty cool. Again, they can change their shape in interesting ways. They can grow new limbs up to the limit of their dexterity if they want to. They have amazing senses of smell because their entire skin surface is an olfactory sensor. Um, they do lack color vision, which is something GMs can use to tweak with Dralocytes a little bit, especially if they're dealing with electronics or things where color coding is very important. But one would assume that technology designed for use by Dralocytes or designed by Dralocytes themselves would include some sort of distinguishing mark that was not color based. Perhaps a pattern of hash marks or something like Braille or little Morse code dots. You're disarming a bomb and someone tells you, cut the dit dit da wire. So, Dralocytes also, since they have no lungs as such, are able to communicate by forming a bellows, more or less. That allows them to make really loud noises at need, which is pretty cool. The Dralocytes are known for having a really weird sense of humor. And I've had players try to pull that off, and sometimes it's funny and sometimes it's groany, but it's usually pretty entertaining. So there are limits to the elasticity of a Dralocyte. As we mentioned before, you can only have a number of limbs equal to your dexterity divided by 10. But also, you can't exactly go completely liquid, even though the illustration does show a Dralocyte flattening itself quite a bit. There are limits to, say, the things that you can slide under, or the things that you can try to flow through. And it is not a fast process. So if you were trying to get through the smallest aperture that your Dralocyte could, it might take a while to do that. So humans are exactly what it says on the tin, except that this version of humans lives for about 200 years, which is kind of cool. These humans, again, are the standard by which you measure everything else, just like in most role-playing games. And I think that's largely because we're human. And so that allows us to gauge all these weird species of creature by what we know of ourselves. The Vrusk. So the Vrusk require really, really different spacesuits, obviously. The Vrusk are insectoid. It's noted that humans are usually a little uncomfortable around Vrusk till they get used to them, just because we're sort of hardwired to react to insects. The Vrusk have very different senses than we do. Their color vision is excellent. They can see further into UV and like the other wavelengths of light than we can. Smell with their antennae, and they can also use their antennae as very sensitive touch organs. They usually have to carry a translator box because their natural speech is clicks and clacks. And I imagine once we get to the Nighthawks box set where you get a listing of planets, some of those planet names probably Vrusk. The ones with the hard K's and T's. So the Vrusk tend to congregate in corporate constructs. They tend to replace sort of the traditional family unit with the business unit. They're very, very business minded. And you'll find Vrusk at all levels of the megacorps on the frontier. So that's kind of the basics of the Vrusk. We already talked about their ability to suss out social cues by observing them, and the fact that they are naturally ambidextrous. Now, because their arms can rotate better than 180 degrees, we used to have a Vrusk character that would carry a satchel full of grenades and just sort of catapult them. That was one of the things that players decided to do with their unusual abilities. And here's the Yazirians. The Yazirians, again, have the ability to fly. They are, glide. They are slightly less strong than the other races because they come from a low gravity planet. They don't live quite as long. They do have the battle rage, which is cool. And they do choose life enemies, which is a very Wookiee thing. And it raised an eyebrow for me because that is something that was established in the lore as something that Wookiees do, and Yazirians do bear a little bit of a Wookiee adjacent look, kind of like Ukla the Mock from the same time period from Thundar the Barbarian. But I am not entirely sure. I'd have to go back and read the old Brian Daley Han Solo novels to see if the whole life enemy thing was in the Han Solo novels and therefore may have been accessible to the team that wrote Star Frontiers. So, yes, the Yazirians are pretty cool. They do have sensitive eyes, so they usually wear the funky goggles. Mostly nocturnal. They're a pretty cool and very popular race with players. And then this is your big bad. Oh, sorry. These are the Sathar. These are the worm-like creatures who are out to get the denizens of the frontier. At the time that most campaigns begin, there's been very little face-to-face contact with the Sathar. There was an entire Sathar war fought before most of the campaigns began, but a lot of that was done ship to ship, and in cases when a Sathar vessel was boarded, it tended to self-destruct. So there was not a lot of physical evidence of the Sathar, and none of them had ever been taken alive at that point. But this is them. This is the bad guys. Again, they're worm-like. They have hypnotic abilities. And they pretty much... There was the quote from the latest Strange New Worlds, the cliffhanger, where Pike says, "Sometimes a monster is just a monster." And, that's meant to make us think, hey, our favorite captain is kind of going off the res here with, understanding aliens, trying to get to know the aliens, trying to figure out why they want to kill us. The Sathar are pretty explicitly written as they want to kill us all. So maybe that's sort of a manifest destiny imperative. Maybe the Sathar believe they're entitled to all this space, and maybe they believe they're superior to other alien races or what have you. But the game assumes that you can't reason with them. And the only reason that one of them might treat with you is to save its own skin, or maybe to set you up for some sort of reversal later. After all, they do have agents everywhere because of their hypnotic abilities. So the Sathar are an interesting bad guy, but they do suffer a little bit from that late 70s, early 80s propensity to create entire races that are evil. So there we go with the Sathar. So we get into skills. There are no classes as such in Star Frontiers, but you do pick a primary skill area, and what that does is give you one area in which you pay the base cost for a skill. All the other skill areas you would pay double cost. So whichever one of the three you choose, military, which is pretty much what it says on the tin, you have access to all the martial skills. Technological, with all your technical engineering skills, and biosocial. You choose one, and you start the game with two skills. One must be from your PSA, and the second can be, but can also be from the other PSAs. The military skills are the least expensive, so it tends to be more cost effective to choose technological or biosocial, and then pick up the military skills at double cost because that's still pretty reasonable. But if you just want to make a character whose entire job is being Jane Cobb out in the frontier, by all means, go with the military PSA. So you pick up your skills. This game, while everything is D%, does not necessarily have what we would call a coherent skill system. Every single skill has a slightly different way to calculate what you can do with it. The military skills are all pretty similar. If it's a weapon skill, you start with half your dexterity or half your strength and add 10% per skill level for your chance to hit with a given weapon. But when you start looking at the other skills, so lower right corner, you can see, hey, weapon skills, half dex plus skill level. And by that, they mean 10% per skill level. It's pretty straightforward. But we get to demolitions, and it has two separate uses of demolitions, each with its own success chance. One for setting charges, one for diffusing charges. Martial arts, you get to choose between hard and soft. Do you want to base your skill on your strength or your dex? And then we get into technological skills. From the computer skill, the entire right-hand column of the page are different things you can do with the computer skill and the different success rates each of them has. So, operating computers, writing programs, defeating security, bypassing security, displaying information, manipulating programs, interfacing computers, and repairing computers. All of that falls under the computer skill, and most of it starts with completely different success rates. And so, Star Frontiers maintains some of that little bit of fiddly that's coming out of the first generation of role-playing games in the 70s. And while it is a little smoother, it's not a lot smoother. You're still looking up all of these different success rates and what you can do with them and writing them all down as sub-skills under a single skill. For instance, the robotics skill stops to explain the different levels of robots in the Star Frontiers game and then gives you all the percentages that you need to figure out what you can do with the robotics skill. We get the technician skill, same thing, it's got different success chances, and it includes the rules for vehicular breakdowns. So you notice a lot of the rules for some systems are bundled in to the actual skill descriptions, and that can cause you to flip back and forth a little bit looking for a rule when the time comes. Biosocial, we get the environmental skill, which of course has things like analyzing ecosystems, finding direction, survival, very important skill to have in your party. And then of course the medical skill, which is also extremely important. So, we have all of these interesting skills, including one of my personal favorites, psychosocial, which falls under the biosocial PSA. Empathy, persuasion, communication, hypnosis, psychopathology. It's an interesting skill that covers a lot of ground, and I like to play characters with the psychosocial skill. But again, each sub-skill is a little different, and they all have different success chances. So you're going to be referring to the book or to your scribbled notes on your character sheet quite a bit. So we have rules for movement, including rules for how far you can move if you're traveling across planet. This becomes important in the Crash on Volturnus module that came with this box set. And in the piece of artwork there at the top of the page, you see another one of these bitchin' 70s vans. I love the Explorer. It kind of reminds me of the Arctic Land Cruiser that we sent down to Antarctica in the 1930s that didn't really work, except these work. Also reminiscent of the Russian Kharkovshanka, if you want to look those up. They're pretty cool. But the Explorer is designed to do exactly what its name says. It's for exploring strange new worlds, except rather than doing that from orbit, lots of teams in Star Frontiers tend to do that on the ground. You land your Explorer vehicle stocked up with supplies and your team, and you roll across the strange new planet, making observations, taking specimens, and basically doing the Lewis and Clark thing in a bitchin' space van. So, We have lots of more detailed rules about wounds, about movement, how to move in low gravity or zero gravity, expanded rules for combat, lots of modifiers for 2 hits. Remember, everything is working off percentages, so it's pretty straightforward, but a lot of times you really have to stop and, oh boy, let's figure out what's the range, what's the. It's like playing Battletech a little bit. And that's not a dig. I love Battletech. But again, you see, there is a 12-step program to figure out what your actual 2-hit roll is going to be. So we have the grenade rules again. We have rules about opportunity fire, about automatic hits, accidentally hitting bystanders, how explosives work. There is another set of rules for melee. Remember what I said about how many hit points people usually have. Your punching score is normally somewhere around 3. You're going to do 3 points of damage with a punch. Bar fights are going to take forever. But there are rules for actually KOing someone. So, depending on how your dice roll, you might just knock somebody out cold before you ever deplete them of stamina. Now, this is where the weapons start to get a little more interesting. Take a look at the melee weapon chart at the bottom of this page. You'll notice there's a column for defense. There are different types of defenses in Star Frontiers, each geared against a different kind of attack. For instance, an inertia screen, which is a lot like what it sounds like, will help defend you against weapons that do kinetic damage. So axes and brass knuckles and chairs and stuff like that. An inertia screen will help absorb that incoming damage. However, it won't do anything against, say, an electric sword or a sonic weapon or an energy weapon. So you're going to want to select your defenses based on what you think the enemy is going to attack you with. It's kind of like choosing which Pokemon to use in a gym boss fight. You want to use the water type against the rock type because Pikachu is going to be useless. And there's a little of that here in Star Frontiers. So taking a look at the ranged weapons, you will see that the laser pistol and laser rifle are now marked as 1d10 per SEU, that standard energy unit. You can adjust the laser pistol and laser rifle to how many points of energy they use per pull of the trigger. Now, of course, you will empty your parabattery or energy clip much faster that way, but you will also do a lot more damage. The laser pistol can be dialed up to 10, so you'll roll 10d10, but you'll only get 2 shots out of a standard SEU power pack. The laser rifle can be dealt all the way up to 20d10 damage, but you're reloading after every shot. Now there are some other interesting weapons like the Sonic Disruptor that has different damage rolls for different ranges. It does its most damage up close, and then the damage falls off over range. The Sonic Devastator is a crew served weapon that does a whole lot more damage. So there are different weapons, including projectile weapons, gyrojet weapons, different types of grenade, and all of them have the possible defense of different types of screens. Now, this piece of art at the bottom of this page, I have loved this piece of art for 4 decades. There is just something cool about the idea of the guy fighting with a sword in one hand, and these may possibly be the electric swords or sonic swords that are talked about in this book, and he's got a shock glove on the other hand. And so I liked this piece of art so much, I thought it was so cool, that we adopted the sword and shock glove as the standard fencing style of one of the great houses in our MechWarrior game. I love when a piece of artwork just grabs you and inspires you to do something with it. And this one inspired me. So we've got rules for damage, we've got rules for avoidance rolls, which are like saving throws, and rules for the different medications and technologies. There's some pretty neat stuff that you can use. In fact, Biocort is basically biocortisone is basically like a heal potion. There's explanations of the screens and suits. Now, your character can only have one suit and one screen at a time, so it's usually a good idea, unless you know the enemy is going to use one kind of weapon and one kind of weapon only, to take the two most common types of weapon and wear one suit geared for one type and a screen geared for the other. Vehicles. So here's where we get some of the cool vehicles that are inspirational about Star Frontiers. Hover cars, hover cycles, ground vehicles, those are all pretty straight up. The Explorer, though, I have always just loved the concept of these giant four-wheeler vans and the ability to travel all over new planets with them. They're amphibious and they can be atmospheric sealed. It's just a great thing to give a group of players and let them tool around with. Glide jets are a combination glider and rocket. Jet copters are really, really fast helicopters. Air cars, a little bit like the air raft of Traveler. And then it talks about the various types of parabattery, because all of these run on straight up electric. There's rules for driving your ground vehicle. Just like every other role-playing game that has vehicle rules, you have rules for the bootlegger turn. The pull-out section in the middle has all of the reference charts, including how the skills break down. So this is pretty darn interesting stuff and useful. Very useful. So we have rules for vehicle combat. And we have rules for creatures. There was a little section for creating creatures in the basic rule book. This expands on that. And there is a short bestiary of creatures that you could run into, like strangler shoots, army rats, the funnel worm, Megasaurus, land whale, the slither. This is a creature that was genetically engineered by the Sathar, so I like to use these. The good old sand shark might remind the D&D crowd of certain things that we have fought in D&D. Wing rippers, the Queequeg. I have a miniature of one of those. I have no idea what I'm going to do with it. Tomar's horses. Here's an equipment list with all the descriptions of the different weapons and the gear. Another picture of an explorer. You can tell that was a pretty popular thing that the artist grasped onto. Explanations of how computers and robots work in Star Frontiers. Little bit of information on the worlds of the frontier. You get an actual map in the next box set. This shows you how far, I mean, this is a map, and it shows you how far the trip is between various stars. But the map that you get in the next box set is actually usable in a board game for playing out the second Sathar War. But we'll talk about that when we cover Nighthawks. We talk about time. Time is actually pretty standardized in Star Frontiers, which is important since every planet is going to have a different rotational period, different day-night cycle. The languages, Pan-Galactic is the lingua franca of the frontier, but anyone can learn different languages. Polyvoxes are like the universal translators. Vrusk used them a lot. And there's a little bit of referee advice. And advice on building adventures. There's a sample adventure here. And information on NPCs. And one of the interesting things about NPCs that I loved, See this chart on the right-hand side of this page about NPC wages? This is how many credits per day a character with a given skill level and a given skill will earn. One of the things that jumped into my brain and stayed there, characters with a projectile weapon skill are referred to as sharpshooters. Characters with a beam weapon skill are referred to as space marines. Characters with a gyrojet skill are referred to as star soldiers. That is a little bit of implied world building. So you would guess that space marines of any sort, whether they belong to a planetary government or to the space fleet that will be introduced to in the next box set, or to a corporation if they have military forces, the space marines will be carrying beam weapons. Star soldiers, which you might expect to be serving planet side, given that a space marine is already on the list, carry gyrojet weapons. So perhaps gyrojet weapons are pretty ubiquitous for ground combat. And then sharpshooters, of course, carry projectile weapons and get paid less than either of the other two. So one might infer from that slug thrower weapons are generally issued to the lowest paid troops, therefore the troops that are able to be afforded by smaller groups, smaller corporations, colonies that are just getting started. It tells you a little bit about the world when you compare these names and the value assigned to hiring these people. So, that brings us to the end of the book. Note that the final page is 60, but the book was noted as a 64-page book. That's because of the pull-out section in the middle. That's the end of this particular book. But there's a couple of things I want to say about Star Frontiers that aren't necessarily covered in the text. So, we take a look at the cover of the book. It says, from the producer of the Dungeons and Dragons games. Okay, fair enough. In fact, during this time period, there were television commercials running that prominently said, hey, from the makers of Dungeons and Dragons. Star Frontiers was advertised on television, as was Marvel and Indiana Jones, products of your imagination. You can find the old advertisements on YouTube if you're interested. But if you take a look here, and here, you'll notice there's no byline. The design is by TSR staff. Steve Winter is noted as the editor, and Larry Elmore for the cover art. But there's no specific author or authors assigned to Star Frontiers. Now, there's a story behind that, and others can tell it with much more authority than I can. But the basic gist is that there was so much meddling going on with the Star Frontiers project at the time it was being written, and TSR decided during that time, a decision that I am given to understand can be traced to the Bloom brothers, Brian and Kevin. There was a decision made that there would no longer be bonuses paid for projects like this and for the way the projects performed in the marketplace. And so, the original team working on this game dropped the game and in some cases left TSR, leaving the game to be published and credited to TSR staff. Again, for the full story on this, you can refer back to books like The Game Wizards, Playing at the World. I cannot remember if Slaying the Dragon has anything specific on this. I believe it picks up a little later. But there are some wonderful history books out there that can be referred to when looking at the early history of TSR. John Peterson, Shannon Appelkline, and Ben Riggs, among others, have done amazing jobs at summing up the history of our hobby. And Star Frontiers did have some difficulty making it to print, and this is one of the little telltales about that. Now, What's something else I want to cover about Star Frontiers? We have just gone through the basic and the advanced rules of this space game, and what have we not seen? Rules for traveling in space. The original Star Frontiers game and the Alpha Dawn reprint both assumed that you would travel aboard vessels provided for you, either commercially or by the megacorps you are working for. This was a big disappointment to a lot of people who bought the game expecting something more like Traveler. The game, as it existed in the initial purchase, had no rules for space travel or owning starships or building starships or fighting starships. So that was a problem. A problem that would be redressed in the Nighthawks box set. And to be fair, Nighthawk's really simple and elegant space combat rules are a game that my gaming group still plays today because it's fun. It was just very well done. It's easy, and it's got some neat critical hit tables, and it's a lot of fun. But some of the core activity that you expect from a space role-playing game was not available to your characters. You don't get rules for trading or carrying passengers or purchasing starships until you get into that Nighthawks box set, which is kind of a problem with Star Frontiers. The other problem is the initial adventure included with Star Frontiers, Crash on Volturnus, is very, very railroady. Not covering Crash on Volturnus in depth because I may cover it in its own video, but the first few scenes of that module, you can hear the choo-choo coming down the track. It is definitely hurting your players toward a specific point, and there is very little they can do to express their agency until they have gotten through those first few events and are dumped on a strange new world with very little gear. And I was in a D&D game like this many years ago where the DM told us as we made our characters, if it's not on your character sheet, you don't have it. We spent hours in 2nd edition going through Aurora's Whole Realms catalog, going through the equipment lists, buying everything that we could possibly buy, making sure that we were loaded for any eventuality. And then we started the game chained to the rowing bench on a slave ship. And all of that gear that we had bought had already been absconded with. The players were extremely upset about that, about the complete waste of time that the gear shopping was, and the fact that everything that we had just spent all that time doing had been taken away from us. The pony that my halfling bought ended up in whatever soup we were served as galley slaves. It was terrible. So Crash on Volturnus kind of gives your players that same feeling. You immediately get railroaded into a situation where you've lost most of your gear and you are marooned. I don't think I'm giving away too much since the title of the module is Crash on Volturnus. But that may not have been the best place to start brand new players with a lot of frustration. I think a more general module may have been a better move. But these things aside, Star Frontiers does remain an old favorite of mine. I dig it out from time to time and run it for folks because I loved it when I was young. I continue to love it now. It does have its limitations. It's got its weirdness. But damn it, just like Gangbusters and Marvel Superheroes, and yes, even Indiana Jones, it's fun to pull out from time to time. So tell me what your experiences with Star Frontiers are. Like, have you played it? Does this video make you want to give it a try? Does it make you want to avoid it like the plague? Are there other science fiction games that you're interested in? Do you want me to cover Crash on Volturnus? Do you want me to cover the Nighthawks box set? Well, I'm gonna cover Nighthawks. I'm just not sure how fast. Next week, we will be getting back to Dungeons and Dragons with the Immortals boxed set. So join us then. And comment down below. Give me some feedback. Give me some information. Allow me to interact with you. This has been the Old Dragoon. And I just want to remind you, character is what you are in the dark. See you next week, everybody.